Sorry I'm late this week on the Torah portion. I was pretty tired yesterday. Been fighting this illness. Don't worry, I'm sure it's not coronavirus. Um, and just getting back into the gym again in the middle of a competition, so I was pushing hard on a body that was already a little bit weak. So yesterday I really took my Sabbath rest seriously. But I went through and I read the portion today, and there's some confusing things in here, and there are some really exciting things in here. So I'm going to start with the confusing thing, because the confusing thing is actually the start of the portion. And this is something that's actually puzzled me for a while. So if anybody has some further insight or commentary on this, I would appreciate it. But I'm just going to read it. It's about the census. And so we're in the Torah portion, Tetzaveh. Sorry, Kitisa. Tetzaveh was last week. And it starts in chapter 30, verse 11. And what it says here is, Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, when you take a census of the Israelite people, according to their enrollment, each shall pay Yahweh a ransom for himself on being enrolled, that no plague may come upon them through their being enrolled. And this is what's really confusing for me, because the ransom is something that essentially, it's the price of a life. If you look up the Hebrew word there, the Hebrew word is kofer, and it means price of a life. And you see the ransom for the firstborn instilled as well, because the firstborn, in commemoration of the Passover, belongs to Yahweh, and you can ransom the firstborn back, so the life, of course, is not taken. But what in the world? Why would a census mean that you have to ransom yourself? I don't get that. And I looked up a couple of the words here in Hebrew. First, I looked up census, because I thought maybe it's not actually a census like we're thinking of, like the census that's happening in the United States now, or it was going to. I don't know if they put it on hold because of what's been going on with the virus. And I also looked up the Hebrew word for enrollment. So just as a reminder, the way it's written is, when you take a census of the Israelite people according to their enrollment. So the census, the word there is roshe, which means head, top, summit, chief, total. So it could be a total, like census as we understand. But the definition is from an unused root meaning to shake the head. So it's almost like the feeling I get here is you're shaking up maybe the leadership of Israel, or you're shaking up the community of Israel. Not quite sure there. And the Hebrew word for enrollment here is pakad, which means to attend to, muster, number, reckon, visit, punish, appoint, look after, and care for. So there's a lot of potential meanings here, and some of them are complete opposites, such as care for and punish, although one could argue that punishing people is caring for them, because you are giving them the punishment so they won't do what they did again, rather than what they deserve, which could be death. But I digress. The definition of the Hebrew word is primitive root, which means to visit, or by analogy to oversee. So there's something going on here with these words. I'm not quite exactly sure what it is. The other interesting thing about the word for ransom is that the definition is properly a cover. And this is where I start to get something that kind of sort of makes sense, because it says, what it says is, pay Yahweh a ransom for himself on being enrolled, that no plague may come upon them through their being enrolled. Now, if you remember, the plagues in Egypt didn't come upon the Israelites. I'm thinking of the very last plague, of course, the death of the firstborn, from which we get Passover. Yahweh acted as a cover, so that the destroyer, the blood was the cover, really, but it was the sign, it was the symbol, it's essentially what told Yahweh this household is to be protected. And so when we see the ransom as being, the definition being a cover, and it's this ransom that protects them from the plague, that makes sense. I still don't know why a census would bring them a plague. So if you have any thoughts, please do share them, because that is very curious for me. Now, verse 15, kind of going deeper into this idea of to cover, what we see is it's talking about the rich and the poor and how much they should pay. Everybody needs to pay the same. The price of a life is the price of a life. everybody's life is equal. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. It says the rich shall not pay more, and the poor shall not pay less than half a shekel when giving Yahweh's offering as expiation for your persons. And this sounds like priesthood language, expiation for your sins. And expiation here is kafar, which means to cover, purge, or atonement. The definition is primitive, but it means cover, appease, cleanse, disannul, forgive. And so the only thing that I could really come up with on this is, if you remember last week in last week's Torah portion, we saw the ceremony for cleansing the Levites to prepare them for their service in the tabernacle. They had to go through this, and they had to go through it for 7 days in order for them to be qualified for the service in the tabernacle. And so my question is this ceremony, this census with this ransom, because what they're giving is supposed to be for Yahweh, it's a gift for Yahweh, and it's supposed to be used towards what's needed for the tabernacle. I'm wondering if this is the ceremony for the community, similar to what we see for the priests. And I have mixed thoughts on that, because they're not cleansing themselves per se, and there is a group of sacrifices for that. But I just can't help but wonder if there is some type of connection between what we saw last week with the priests and what we're seeing this week with the community. So moving on, I really like looking up the meaning of names, if you haven't figured that out already. And in chapter 31, we see names. And these are the names of 2 people that have been singled out by Yahweh and given the skills needed to make what is required for the tabernacle, in terms of tabernacle for the vestments, the clothing that Aaron and his sons are going to wear, the lampstand, things for the tent of meeting, etc., etc. You get the idea. And so I wanted to look up the significance of the meaning of the names of these people, because it's not just their names that are listed, it's also their father's names, and in one instance, their grandfather's name. And so the first person singled out by name, which is the phrase that's used here, is Bezalel, son of Uri, son of Hur, and he's of the tribe of Judah. And so Judah is also the same tribe that our Messiah is from, the fourth born son. If you want to connect it to the Hebrew alphabet, that's the Dalet, which is the door, and we know that Yeshua is the door to the Father and salvation. So Bezalel is from the tribe of Judah. His name means in the shadow of God, which shadow here can also mean protection. His father's name, Uri, is fiery. Could also be, there's connotations of the east, as that being the region of light. And this is the one that's really curious. Hur, the grandfather, means whole. And when I was looking up in Strong's, there are a couple words that this word is related to, it seems to have its origins in, and one of them does mean a hole or to bore, the action of boring a hole, but also can mean white cloth, and as we know, white is the symbol of purity. And so it's interesting because you have the protection of God, you have the fire or the light, and you have purity. So not quite sure what that means, but take that for what it is, and if you have any interesting thoughts on that, please do share them. Now, the next person that's been mentioned by name, and this is actually a person that was assigned by Yahweh to be a helper for Bezalel, and that's Oholiab, son of Ahisamach. Curiously enough, this man is from the tribe of Dan, and Dan is actually the tribe who later becomes known as the idolatrous tribe. And in fact, later on in the book of Revelation, we don't even see Dan counted among the 12 tribes of Israel, and there's a lot of suspicion that the reason why is because of the idolatry that the tribe of Dan partook in. Oholiab means father's tent, and Ahishamach, his father's name, means my brother is support. So here you have the family theme going on, the father, the brother. Again, not totally sure what the significance is there, but I'm sure there's something, and if you have anything that you can share, please do share it. Now, the next bit of scripture I want to point out is just one of my favorite passages, because it shows how special Sabbath is. And I'm just going to read chapter 31, verses 12 through 17. And what it says is, Yahweh said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelite people and say, 'Nevertheless, you must keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you through the ages, that you may know that I, Yahweh, have consecrated you. You shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy for you. He who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his kin. 6 days may work be done, but on the seventh day there shall be a Sabbath of complete rest, holy to Yahweh. Whoever does work on the Sabbath day shall be put to death. The Israelite people shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout the ages as a covenant for all time. It shall be a sign for all time between me and the people of Israel. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day he ceased from work and was refreshed." Sabbath is really important. Here it's referred to a couple of times as a sign, and it's a sign of the covenant. That's how people know which God we're in covenant with. And we're in covenant with Yahweh. And why would the Sabbath mean that he's the God that we're serving? Well, it says it right here at the end. It goes all the way back to creation. On 6 days he worked, he created everything. On the seventh he rested. So in essence, by keeping Sabbath, what we're doing is we are proclaiming that he is the creator, which means he is God of all. He's the king of the universe. There is no God above him. If he created everything, then nothing and no one can be above him. And so Sabbath is more than just a day set aside for worship or for spending time with family. Certainly it's for those things, but the deeper meaning and significance of it is so much more than that. And I think when we start taking it seriously for what it really is, then it becomes a bit more obvious and a bit more sacred, and as to why we should protect it so much. It's not just, well, yeah, we're doing the best we can with what we have. I can see that in a lot of cases. A great example is last night, we went to some friend's house. They invited us for dinner. They served pasta with ground meat in it. We were told it was beef from a cow that we had also gone in with on these people. So we'd had the ground beef before, and then later it was revealed that there was some pork mixed in with the beef. And, that's not something that I did on purpose. As far as I knew, everything was fine. And it happens sometimes. You live in a world where people are not serving the Father, and sometimes that's going to happen. But I don't see the Sabbath as one of those things that could or should be treated that way. Not to say that it's more important. All of the Torah is important. We need to keep it all. But the Sabbath is special because it's not just a commandment. It's a sign of the covenant. And yes, I understand that there are some jobs that have to be done on Sabbath. And I'm not against that. The priests also worked on Sabbath. Their work in the tabernacle never ended. It went on the Sabbath too. So if you work in healthcare, policeman, firefighter, you're serving the community just like the priests were. I get that. But let's not forget why the Sabbath is so important, and why we should hold it into such high esteem, and maybe not be okay with letting things slip sometimes, or being like, oh well, did the best I could. Really, it's not that hard to refrain one day a week. Most of us do it on Sunday anyway, so we're just different than the rest of the world, and we do it on Saturday instead. So that's my soapbox. And then in verse 18, right after this discussion of Sabbath, that's when we finally get the tablets of stone. Moshe receives the tablets, which have been inscribed with the finger of God, as it says in verse 18 here in chapter 31. Now, you know what happens next, and I don't want to go too much into it, but I do want to point out just a couple of things. I think you've probably heard it taught before that they weren't necessarily making a god to replace Yahweh. In fact, in verse 5, Aaron says he builds an altar, and he announces tomorrow shall be a festival of Yahweh. So there's a lot of cultural stuff that has to deal with the way they learned things in Egypt. This is a god, but it doesn't mean it's Yahweh God. But that's the point. Yahweh is one, right? And that's what we hear with the Shema. There's not supposed to be worship of other gods. And what the Israelites were used to was different gods leading them. And they kind of saw Moses in this light, right? And that becomes clear when we read this. So what they're saying to Aaron is, come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that man Moses, we do not know what's happened to him. So Moses had been their leader, but he's gone. He's been up on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. They're like, what the heck is going on? Make us a god to go before us. And if you look at the Hebrew words here, go means walk, and before means face. So it's not simply, it's this idea of the God is walking in their presence or walking before their face, and leading them. And what we see actually in chapter 32, verse 23, this is kind of what Aaron says when he's confronted by Moshe. In 23, he says, they said to me, make us a god to lead us, right? So that's essentially what was going on. They needed a new leader. They're stuck in the wilderness. They don't know what to do. Their intercessor between them and Yahweh is gone. They don't know where he's gone, and so they need a new God to become the intercessor between them and Yahweh. But that's not how Yahweh works, and they kind of quickly forgot that, or seemingly haven't learned it yet. And what's so interesting and sad, and there's a lot of different adjectives you could use to describe this, but they actually make sacrifices and have a meal. So essentially they're establishing a covenant with this God, this symbol, this golden calf, whatever it is that they made to be their intercessor. And this comes right on the heels of the covenantal meal that they had with Yahweh. And so they've already kind of committed idolatry, as it were, by making sacrifices and having a covenantal meal with another God, in addition to Yahweh, which is a big no-no. Yahweh Echad. Yahweh is one. There is one and only God. Only one God. Now in verse 20, Moshe does something very interesting. He takes the golden calf and he grinds it into a powder, and he adds it to water, and he makes the Israelites drink it. And this reminds me of the trial for the woman who's been accused of committing adultery by her husband. Some of the dust from the tabernacle is taken, mixed with the water, and she drinks it. And if it harms her, she's guilty. And if nothing happens, then she's innocent. And so I think these two are definitely the same thing. And especially if you consider what we just been talking about. This is idolatry. And idolatry is spiritual adultery. And so the woman committing adultery, she drinks this dust and water. Israel has committed adultery against Yahweh through their idolatrous ways, and they drink the dust and the water. Now, going back to this whole thematic of they need someone to lead them, and that's really what it was all about. Good intentions, but not serving Yahweh the way he wants. Does that sound familiar? I'm just going to leave it there. Chapter 32, verse 34. I just will read that. It says, go now, lead the people where I told you. See, my angel shall go before you. So he's telling the Moshe to lead the people. You are the leader, not this golden calf. And on top of that, my angel is going to go before you. Very interesting. So, of course, we recognize this as Yeshua. Let's take this a little bit, the connection, I think, I mean, we kind of already get it anyway. It's just very obvious with this verbiage. But let's go to chapter 33, verse 13, and it says, let's start with 12. Moshe says to Yahweh, you say to me, lead this people forward, but you have not made known to me whom you will send with me, just said an angel. Further, you have said, I have singled you out, and you have indeed gained my favor. Now, if I have truly gained your favor, pray let me know your ways. Consider, too, that this nation is your people. And he said, he, being Yahweh, I will go in the lead and will lighten your burden. So first Yahweh says he's sending his angel. Here he says, I, and he says something very interesting, will lighten your burden. What did Yeshua say? Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. And we know that Yahweh and Yeshua are one. So here it is. It's all coming together. And it's beautiful, and I love it. And the prayer that Moshe, I call it a prayer. I don't see why it can't be considered a prayer. In verse 13, he says, if I have truly gained your favor, pray let me know your ways, that I may know you and continue in your favor. I think this should be all of our prayer. We should pray this every day. We should constantly be striving to learn more of Yahweh, to know his ways, to walk in his ways, so that we can continue in his favor and in his blessing. Now in verse 18, this is when Moshe asks Yahweh if he can see his presence. Some translations say face. I think the very common teaching, or at least what I kind of grew up understanding, was he wanted to see physically Yahweh, which seems really weird because it's already said earlier in this passage that he meets with Yahweh and he converses with him as a man converses with another man. So is scripture contradicting itself here, or what's going on? In the JPS version, which is what I'm using, he asks to see his presence. The Hebrew word here is kabod, which means glory, honor, reputation, and weight, as in weighty. Now, if you remember back, this is the exact same word that we discussed last week with the Levitical priests and their clothing. And we had talked about how it could be that this word that means weighty and weight, maybe it's used to describe the significance of their job, right? Of cleansing the tabernacle and the people of Israel so that they can dwell in the presence of God without any death occurring. And so what I'm seeing here is that Moses is asking for much more than just seeing God's face. He's asking for his essence, for everything, his glory, his honor, his reputation. Yahweh, I want to see it all. And Yahweh's answer is interesting. He says he can see his goodness. He's going to show his goodness, and he'll proclaim his name before him. And so his goodness could be, equated to his glory and honor, because it's his goodness that gives him those things. And the reputation, which is another meaning of kabod, is from the name. He's going to proclaim his name. And that's his reputation. But he cuts it short. He says, you cannot see my face, for no man can see me and live. So Moshe gets part of it, but he doesn't get the whole thing. And this happens in the rock. He says, I'll station you in the rock. I'll cover you with my hand. And then when I pass by, you can look at my back, but you can't see my face. And in verse 34, chapter 6 through 7, the reputation, the name of Yahweh that we get proclaimed is this. It says, Yahweh, Yahweh, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. Yet he does not remit all punishment, but visits the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children upon the 3rd and 4th generation. And then we get the replacement of the tablets, and what's very interesting this time is that Moses is the one who does the work. He carves them and he writes on them. Last time they were written by the finger of God, but this time it's Moses who has written them. And essentially what's happening is Yahweh said, I'm going to drive out all these people before you, but I'm not going to go in your midst because I'm just going to end up killing you. You're stiff-necked and stubborn. And Moses is praying, please don't do that. And there's a covenant that essentially, it's interesting that this is the verbiage used, but Yahweh says, here's the covenant. I'm going to do all these wonders, and I'm going to drive out all these people. And that's kind of where the Torah portion ends. So some very interesting things, some very confusing things. And that's exactly why I'm doing these portions, because it happens a lot where something that's confused me for years, I come back one year and I read it and it's like, oh, why was this so confusing? And it's just, I know the revelation comes when he knows I'm ready for it. And I just wanted to share these revelations with other people who are dear to me, and even people who might stumble upon this who I don't even know, and hear other people's revelation, because we're all at different stages in our walk, and we can all teach each other something new and something interesting, because we're not all in the same place. So I hope you enjoyed it this week. Again, I apologize for being late on this, and I'll do my best to make sure that doesn't happen this week. Shalom, shalom.